All right. Any other thoughts? Any other thoughts on what we've learned? Let me remind us of something. Big point, simple way to explain what we learned in a big point. We looked at a parable in Mark chapter 4 where most of the time or most often it was said, or after we read that particular passage or chapter, it has been said that parables were mysteries or confusing, or that Jesus used them to keep certain people from understanding what he was trying to say. And the point of it all, the simple point of it is, a parable is not intended to be a mystery. A parable is not intended to confuse, and a parable is definitely not a riddle. I'll say that again. A parable's intention was not to be a mystery, although it may reveal mysteries of God's kingdom. It's not intended in itself to be a mystery.
Okay, KOC?
Yes, sir.
We bring this out that parables are meant for us to see ourselves in a parable?
We hadn't said that yet, but great.
Okay.
Excellent.
All right.
Excellent. True. Parables are meant for you and I, intended for you and I to see ourselves inside of that parable or God's truth. That's where the transformational change happens, when you read a parable and you identify, where can you be inside of this? In this situation, how do I see myself? Where do I see myself? All right. Yeah, good stuff. But again, a parable is not intended to be a mystery. A parable is not intended to confuse. And a parable is not a riddle. It's not a riddle.
Could we say that a parable is like a point of reference?
There is. Watch this. It's a point of reference for an abstract meaning. I mean, to make an abstract meaning clear. Let me say that again. It's a point of reference to make an abstract meaning more clear. It's a point of reference to make an abstract meaning clear. All right. Yes. But I'll say this again. It's not intended to be a mystery. It's not expected to confuse, nor is it a riddle. Nor is it a riddle. All right.
KOC, you started to say something about it was not intended to be a mystery. However, it may reveal mysteries. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Excellent. Thank you for bringing that back. So yeah, so it's not intended to be a mystery. However, it does reveal mysteries of the kingdom of God. It's not intended to be a mystery itself. However, a parable does reveal mysteries of the kingdom of God. So that's a big difference. I'll say it again. It's not a mystery itself, but it's intended to reveal mysteries of the kingdom of God. And I'm saying that to say, when we begin to learn how to outline, a lot of this has to replay in your mind, or you will be led astray, or you will apply misinformation. And you'll see what I'm talking about as we practice outlining together. All right. Let's see. Let me do this, and then I'm going to come back with some more definitions. But to help make some of the definitions or explanations we've just observed, shared, reviewed, to make them more meaningful, let me give us what we should do when we begin to outline a parable. So let me try this. You guys let me know if you can see this or not. All right, what can we see? What do we see? Somebody tell me.
I see who can see what you share here.
Okay, so is it a whiteboard? Everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So I'm going to first thing, and you should follow my example. The first thing I'm going to do is write out our scriptures. All right, I want us to follow my example. Very important. Seems redundant, but the next step is important because you got to have this in the forefront of your mind. So the first thing I'm going to do is write out our verse, Luke chapter 14, verse 7 through 11. All right, I always like to identify which translation I'm using. Start with verse 7, and he says, and he began speaking a parable to the invited guests. When he noticed how they had been picking out places of honor at the table, saying to them, all right, verse 8, when you are invited by someone more distinguished than, I'm sorry, I skipped something. Yeah, when you are invited, I'm sorry. When you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for someone more distinguished than you may have been invited by him. Verse 9, and he who invited you both will come and say to you, give your place to this man. And then in disgrace, you proceed to occupy the last place. Verse 10, but when you are invited, go and recline at the last place, so that when the one who has invited you comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher, then you will have honor in the sight of all who are at the table with you. Verse 11 is a summarization of it all. For everyone who exalts himself will be humble. And he who humbles himself will be exalted. All right. Everybody finish writing? Basically, what I wrote down here just as a message to us. All right. Basically, what I wrote down is how to outline a parable or identify the steps to outlining a parable. This is what this is what we're about to do next. The reason why writing the verse out is important, the reason why reviewing the verse is so vital, as many times as necessary, is because of this first outline point. And it's simple. I like to do A equals observations. That's the first thing we're going to do is we want to create a list of observations, but I'm going to help us with descriptions of how to what kind of observations we should describe. All right. But the first thing we want to do is we want to be able to pick out all of the observable observations. And basically, this is part of our study technique. Remember, our six rules. We read the text, we read the pre and the post text, we write out the text, and then the next thing we do is write down what stands out. That's our observations. When we write down what stands out, we write down our observations. But I want to help guide us as it relates to parables from what we know a parable is. So the first type of observation we want to write out is the subject of the parable. So this is the instructions. Identify the subject or subjects of the parable. All right. Everybody got it? You still tracking? Somebody repeat back what we have so far.
But you saying the outline of a paragraph, and I can't see that it's identify, but it's not in the middle of the screen. That's what I was gonna tell you.
Okay.
You know.
All right. How about now?
And we all, no, I still can't see it in the middle there. You know, I see it say identify D, and I don't know what that word is after D.
Okay.
You know, but I can see the number one thing. Like I see A, observe it. Then I can see identify the subject of the paragraph. I see that.
All right, hold on. How about now?
Well, I still can't see it.
Kayusa, that was a little notice, like a note that popped up, and I had to click on an X to get it out of the way. I couldn't see it at first, but I see it after I clicked on that little X.
Where it say who can see what you're sharing? That's what you're talking about?
Yes,
Nico?
there's an X on there. You can X that out.
Okay, let me try it.
Then it was in my way too.
Nah, mine didn't go nowhere.
Yeah, it's for some reason it's not in the middle of the screen. But I can move it back and forth on my phone. Okay, use it to see it, but I have to turn my phone sideways to see everything. But I'm on my phone, so
Yeah, so I think it might have to do with everybody's screen, like Zena mentioned. You may have to move it around on your screen. Now, what I do see is, I'm recording. As I record and I look at the whiteboard on the recording, I can see it being visible. So it's in the middle of the screen because I'm watching the Zoom recording on another screen, and I'm looking at my original screen, and it's in the center and it's in the middle. So just rest assured that when we look at the recording, you will be able to see it, but right now it's a matter of your screen's viewpoint. All right. But what we have is somebody just put in the chat. All right. You good, Brother Will?
Yeah, I am.
All right.
I'm tracking. Okay.
Okay.
You know?
Excellent. All right.
Yeah.
So again, we're going to make sure that we, in creating the outline, we identify the steps of outlining the parable. The first one is observation. And so it's similar to our study technique. But the first observation in outlining a parable is identifying the subjects of the parable. All right, who are the subjects of this parable?
You asking that question, Case, or what?
Yeah, that's a question for the group.
Okay, that would be the invited guest.
All right, excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. So the subjects of the parable are the invited guests. So identify those. All right. And so I'm gonna read the parable again for us. So he says, when you are invited by someone, that's the description of an invited guest, someone who's been invited. All right. So when you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, all right. So we identified the subjects are the invited guests. Now watch this. If the subject of this parable is an invited guest, and one of the goals of the parable is for you and I to see ourselves inside the parable. How do we have to see ourselves, or who do we see ourselves as in this parable?
Invited guest.
As an invited guest. All right. If not, we hadn't made it personal, and we can't expect transformative change within ourselves. So we have to see ourselves as an invited guest as the illustration is being taught. All right. So as the illustration is being taught, we have to see ourselves as an invited guest. You got to move it back down because on the screen. Let's see. Excellent, excellent. All right, Zayna, thanks. Okay. So now, second point. Number 2. All right. So the first one is identifying the subjects of the parable. We've identified. The next one, the next observation is we have to observe the main actions of the subject. So identify the main actions of the subject. All right. Identify the main actions of the subject. All right. And so this is a long step. What are some actions of the subject? In the parable only for right now. And let's try to summarize the actions as we can. Come on.
Picking out places of honor.
All right. So well, that's not necessarily in the parable itself. We're gonna come back to that.
Okay.
But inside, let's look at inside the parable first. Because again, we're gonna come back to that. That's gonna help us compare why the parable was taught in the first place. But look inside of the parable. Let's look inside of the parable and look at describe the actions in the parable.
Do not take the place of honor.
All right. So do not take the place of honor, which in a sense, the opposite of that is picking out places of honor. All right. So, but right now we just want to simply say, do not take the place of honor. All right. That's an action. Not taking the place of honor. All right. Any other actions in the parable? Any other actions in the parable that we see by the subjects?
Sit in the low place.
Yeah. Sit in a low place or proceed to occupy the last place.
So, so would it be to say that everyone who exalts himself,
Well, that's
there
an
won't be no action?
that's an abstract. So
Abstract. Okay.
that's not an action yet.
Okay.
So we want to identify the observable actions. So
What,
Would it
what
be
about
move
what
up
about the
higher?
invitation?
all right, I heard move up higher. That's one. Um,
What about the invitation?
well, the invitation is centered around describing the subject. It says when you are invited. So you know, it's almost it's abstract in a sense about trying to describe how you were invited or the invitation itself. So that wouldn't be an observable action in the parable, right? Because when the scene starts, the guests have already received the invitation and have already been invited and are already present at the wedding feast. So in the word picture description, we don't necessarily see them accepting the invitation. They've already accepted it. So it wouldn't describe the actions in the parable of the subjects. However, somebody else mentioned something. All right, come on, Mr.
What? Oh, go ahead. Whoever, go ahead. Okay, is somebody there?
All right, go ahead. We come. Hold on
What?
one second. Come on, Miss
Go
Loretta.
ahead.
You described an action earlier.
Yeah, I described the action of move up higher.
Okay. All right.
But
Or
I also see another action there. Now I'm thinking this is an action also. Give your place to this man. Is
all
that
right.
an action?
Oh yes. Oh yes. That's an action the subject is carrying out. Give place to this man. And that's in connection. It's actually describing in a different way the same action of occupying the last place. So when we say give place to this man / occupy the last place, that's describing the same action. It's just a different description for that action, if that makes sense.
Yes.
All right. All right. You mentioned another action first.
Move up higher.
Move up higher. All right. So let's look at that. All right. Move up higher is the directions the one who invited gave, but what was the response to the direction of move up higher by the subject?
Then you will have honor in the sight of those who have the title being say to you. Then you will have honor. Right.
Well,
Go and recline at the last place so that when from the invite you come say move friend move up higher.
honor isn't necessarily the action, it's
Yeah.
the outcome. We're going to talk about that in a moment. So keep that in mind. Move up higher was the instructions given by the one who invited. All right.
Okay. Action.
So we got to find the actions. Let's keep looking for the action.
Recline at the last place.
Yes. So another action is recline at the last place. Can everybody still see my screen or not? Are we still?
Yes, yes, see it well.
Okay. All right. Okay. So try to organize that in a little better way. So summarize some of the actions we see by the subject. So the invited guests are the subject. Inside of the parable, all right, we see not taking the place of is an action. All right. We see sitting in the lowest place is an action. We also see proceed to occupy the last place, which redescribes sitting in a lower place is an action. Give place to this man redescribes the same action of proceeding to occupy the last or sitting in the lowest place. It redescribes the same action. Now here's an opposite action. Recline at the last place. I'm going to put in parentheses an opposite action. And I'll explain why we're doing that in a second. Any other actions we see by the subject? So in so many ways, there's two potential actions, all right? Both have outcomes. So one action we see is do not take the place of honor. Watch this, which redescribes the action of reclining at the last place. So those are the same types of actions. So we seeing do not take the place of honor when we sit down, but to redescribe how we don't take the place of honor, we could simply say recline at the last place. So those two types of actions would go side by side. However, we see a complete opposite action, sitting in the lowest place, which redescribes proceed to occupy the last place, which also redescribes giving place to that man. So there are only two types of actions described. Make sense? Comments or questions?
Can you see, should we have move up higher, or was that not considered an action?
Yeah, move up higher is a command or instructions given. See, now watch this. Think about our definition of the parable. Remember, a parable compares the nature, the attributes, and the character of God. Watch this, compared to the human responses. So move up higher is instructions inside of the character and nature of God, but the response to that reveals the human action as we respond to that statement or character, right? So we're not there yet, but just want to put it in perspective if that makes sense. All right. But without our definitions of parables, it would be hard to identify and point these things out. So let me pause for a moment just to make sure we're all on the same page and this is making sense before we move on, because I'm gonna clarify this in just a second of what we have so far. But comments, reflections, feedback, or observations from you guys so far? And this is kind of like breaking news. Y'all know what happens on a breaking news report. They usually say updates will proceed afterwards, right? So we're and this is live information. So we're gonna update this as we all, walk through this, right? So we got our observations so far. Somebody repeat back some of the observations we have so far.
Do not take the place of honor is the first one.
All right. Well, what's even before that?
So identify the subject.
Observation.
All right.
The subject is the invited guest
All right.
of the observation.
Yep, the subjects. And if I was you guys, I would be downloading these notes Zena just posted in our chat. All right. So the first observation is the subject. The instructions to find the observation is identify the subjects of the parable. But the actual observation or identifying the subjects, we write down invited guests. So we see invited guests as the subjects. What's next?
Identify the main actions of the subject.
Yeah, so now we want to identify the main actions of the subject, but keep this in mind. When we identify the main actions of the subject, summarize it and keep it simple. So we want to summarize the actions, but we want to keep them simple. So we're going to summarize them and keep them simple. Now, what else did we learn in it? As we summarize the actions, what did we learn about the actions of the subject so far? Well, let me give it to us. Well, what we learned is there are two types of actions. We see two types of actions. We've described them. We got 5 descriptive summaries about 2 types of actions, but there are only 2 types of actions in this particular parable by the subject. One type of action describes it as not taking the place of honor. Another way to describe not taking the place of honor is reclining at the last place. That's the positive action. Not taking the place of honor or reclining at the last place is the positive action. The second type of action is sitting in the lowest seat, which is the negative action, or proceed to occupy the last place, or giving place to this man.
Ace, can you repeat that again? Do not take the place of honor, and then the positive is what now?
Yeah. So with 2 types of actions. There's a positive action and there's a negative action. All right. There's a positive action and there's a negative action. The positive action is not taking the place of honor. Another way to describe it, or another way it was described, is reclining at the last place. So do not take the place of honor. And reclining at the last place describe the same type of actions by the subject, which is a positive action. Well,
Question,
come on.
how can I better choose a positive action opposed to a negative action?
The answer is abstract. That's the answer the rabbi, the teacher, is trying to convey to the student, which is the whole point of the parable.
Okay. It's coming, it's coming.
All right. So to summarize, that answer is usually what we try to conclude last. So if you will, keep that question in mind.
Okay.
Because what I'm learning about it is gathering information first, putting in bullet points into the equation, and then after we get all the bullet points in the equation, ask that answer again to see if the answer is obvious after we get all the information plugged in, right? And that's what a parable usually does for the students.
Mm-hmm. What do you want here?
All right, that's what it usually does for the students. All right.
Okay, thank you.
So Zena, did that answer your question as well, or help clarify your request?
Yeah, you said do not place of honor / reclining at the last place is the positive action.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. And so so let me describe those positive and negative actions in a different way. The positive action can be described as the worthwhile action. The negative action can be described as the worthless action. All right. So just keep that in mind. All right. There's a positive action, which can be described as the worthwhile action. And then there's a negative action that could be described as the worthless action. All right. What's the opposite of something beneficial?
Harmful.
Harmful. All right. So there's a beneficial action and there's a harmful action. The positive action is beneficial. The negative action is harmful. The worthwhile action is beneficial. The worthless action is harmful. So now let's rewrite these identifiable actions and let's place them in the positive, worthwhile, beneficial category. And then we got a negative, worthless, harmful category. So positive actions is not taking the place of honor. And the other positive action is reclining at the last place. Now let's look at the negative actions. sitting in the lowest seat or the lowest place, or proceed to occupy the last place, or give place to this man.
Oh man. Oh man.
Well, you see, Brother Will.
Well, how do you know that was me? Because I can see everything good now.
Okay. All right.
It's finally got to the center of my screen.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, man.
And now I can't see it, but that's fine.
Slot. I don't know what I did.
I got it now. I see it. I see it.
All right. Okay. All right. Hopefully this helps. And this is just, these aren't answers. This is just preliminary work. This is reconnaissance. All right. This isn't the answer. This is the work it takes to start outlining. We got a lot of work left. A lot of work left. And I'm learning how to use this whiteboard too. So y'all get the benefit of my practice.
Casey, I have a question.
All right.
So in the negative actions, we have sitting in the lowest place. Is that in the negative because it was just assumed that they were first sitting in the highest place?
Ask one more time to make sure I can answer.
So it seems like sitting in the lowest place would be positive, but is it just assumed that sitting in the action of sitting in the lowest place means that they were instructed to sit in the lowest place, which is why it's negative? I guess my question is, it's not clear why that's negative.
Yeah. Good question. Yeah, I was gonna clear that up in a moment to kind of distinguish, the summation of it all. Think about verse 11. All right. To get a positive answer, we have to do something negative. Or to get a positive result, we have to do something negative first. Think about it. So just the fact of thinking about sitting in a low place seems to be a negative action from observation, if that makes sense. Not necessarily, I hadn't talked about the outcome of each of them yet. Just the idea of having to sit in the lowest place appears or has the appearance of a negative action. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. All right. All right. So let's see. Just kind of distinguishing those actions. Now we need to summarize them in one statement. Let's see how we did this or how I did it. All right. So we got to figure out how we can summarize these actions in one or two statements. All right, that's our goal. So we see these actions, we see the action of not taking the place of honor or reclining at the last place. And then we see the action of sitting in the lowest place or proceeding to occupy the place. All right. Let's see how we can do this. But these are our actions. Let me come back to that. We're going to summarize it in a moment. Let me come back to that. And let me go with some more instructions. All right. Let's read the parable one more time, if you will. Somebody read verse 8, 9, and 10 for us.
Okay, go ahead.
It says, when you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you may have been invited by him. And he who invited you both shall come and say to you, give place to this man, and then in disgrace you proceed to occupy the last place. But when you are invited, go and recline at the last place, so that when the one who has invited you comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will have honor in the sight of all who are at the table with you. For everyone who exalts himself shall be humbled, and he who humbles himself shall be exalted.
All right. So now what we have to do is we have to try to identify what is abstract. All right. Because from the response of the actions, it should produce thoughts in the subjects. I'll say that again. The response of the actions should produce thoughts in the hearts of the subjects. So the invited guest, all right, if an invited guest does not take the place of honor by sitting in the lowest seat, what thoughts would that produce in that person? What are some thoughts? I'll say that again. Let me write this out.
Did you say the response of the action should produce thoughts of the invited guests? Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah. Yes. All right. And so let me ask a question. What thoughts would actions of the subject produce? All right. Now say what I said again, Zena, in that way.
Repeat what I just said.
Yes.
The response of the actions should produce thoughts of the invited guests.
All right. So the outcome is the actions of the invited guests should produce thoughts within themselves. All right. So what thoughts would these actions produce in the invited guests?
Pastor Keusi,
Go ahead.
I think the invited guests would wonder amongst themselves who would be the most honorable and who is not, who is to occupy the place of honor and who should not. It would bring such a thought in their midst, because they would not know who would sit in the higher place and who would sit in the lower place. That is what I think.
Okay. All right. Excellent. So one of the thoughts, well, my summarization of that is, one of the thoughts it will produce is who is the most honorable? Or another way to say it is, am I being honored or am I being dishonored? Would that summarize your statement a little bit?
Yes, Pastor Keusi.
All right. Does everybody agree that those are some thoughts that they will produce?
I agree.
All right.
But can I ask a question?
Please do.
Okay. Okay. I have to be real, Casey. Okay.
Come on.
I'm saying if I was given, if the host came to me and say, come up, move up here closer, Will, to the place of honor, I'm just being honest. I might get puffed up, you know.
You might get puffed up.
Yeah, I might, because I'm saying, man, you know, like, I mean, I got to become more spiritual, but I could be like, wow, you know, I don't call nobody name, but whoever was sitting at the place of honor, and because that don't happen to me. That's why I'm saying it. And somebody was up sitting where the host was at, and the host came and got me and said, no, you sit here. And I had trouble then not being puffed up. So now I don't think I would now. I hope I wouldn't.
Hey, I need to do something. Zena, are you there?
Yes.
Can you walk everybody through your notes, and I'll be right back. Can you read your notes line by line for everybody to make sure you got them so far?
You want me to start at the beginning with the actual parable?
Yes.
Okay.
I'll be right back.
Okay, so what I have in my notes is, oh my gosh, I cannot see y'all. Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so how to outline a parable. Identify the steps to outlining a parable. And then I have for verse 7, and he began speaking a parable to the invited guests when he notices how they had been picking out places of honor at the table, saying to them, and then I have verse 8 as, when you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor for someone more distinguished than you may have been invited by him. Verse 9, and he who invited you both will come and say to you, give your place to this. I think I'm missing a word. Give your place to this person. And then in disgrace, you proceed to occupy the last place. Verse 10, but when you are invited, go and recline at the last place, so that when the one who has invited you comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will have honor in the sight of all who are at the table with you. Verse 11, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. I have A for observations. And the first observation that I have, number 1, identify the subject or subjects of the parable, which equals the invited guests. Number 2, identify the main actions of the subject, which equals, I have in parentheses, summarize the actions. If I'm going too fast, please let me know. Summarize the actions, but keep it simple. There is a positive action and a negative action. The positive action can be described as the worthwhile action, and the negative action can be described as the worthless action. There's a beneficial, which is positive action, and a harmful, which is a negative action. Positive / worthwhile / beneficial. And as for A, I have do not take the place of honor, reclining at the last place as a positive. Negative, worthless, harmful action, sit in the low place and occupy the last place, give place / give place. For C, I have proceed to occupy the last place. For D, I have give place to this man. The last thing I have is summarize the actions in 1 or 2 statements. The response of the actions should precede thoughts of the invited guests. What thoughts would the actions of the subject produce? What thoughts would these actions produce? Actions produce in the invited guests.
All right. Good stuff. Thanks.
You're welcome.
All right. So one of the disciplines that I have to continue to apply here, and what I'm trying to do is get you to where I arrived, but I'm trying to create a system of how I got to my overall outline points, which came from my observations. But I have to create this draft, this somewhat lengthy draft, simple draft, but I have to continue to apply the discipline of stop trying to find the answer now. And that's what we're weaving back and forth in, trying to find all the answers and the keys as we go. But that's not what the goal is right now. We're just trying to write down the observations and figure out how to summarize them simply. And again, so if I started over now, we'll have maybe 3 outline points. We'll have our observations, main observations. One is the subject, which is our invited guest. And then I would have summarized the 2 types of actions. One is not taking the place of honor. And if I'm not taking the place of honor, it simultaneously says or suggests that I sit in the lowest seat. But if I don't take the place of honor, or I have taken the place of honor, proceeding to occupy the last place or seat describes the same action as not taking the place of honor. We're not looking at the results yet. So let me explain. 2 types of actions. One is not taking the place of honor, which means I sat in the lowest seat, which also means I proceeded to occupy the last seat or place, which further means I gave place to somebody else. All right. And now we see why those actions are similar. All right. Now here's the second type of action, which we described as worthless, negative, or harmful, is I'm sorry, which is positive, which is not, oops, hold on, I mixed those up. Hold on. I think I mixed those up, y'all. Everybody see? Yep, I did. All right. Anybody see what I did wrong? I do.
Can you explain it? Because I don't want my notes to be wrong.
Yeah. All right, let me re-describe the actions for us. One action is sitting in the lowest seat, occupying the last seat, which means I didn't take the place of honor. The other action is sitting in the place of honor, sitting in the place of honor and taking the higher seat.
Case, I have a question. Because these like actions are, you have like a action and then a opposite action. Would it be wise to like know where in the verse you got that from? Like, as I'm trying to make sure I'm following as well. And so like when it says do not take the place of honor, that's in what verse? That's in verse 8, right? And And that corresponds to, or like the opposite of that. You said the opposite is of do not take the place of honor is hold on, let me go back to
Is it sitting in the lowest place? Would that be the negative?
It is, and yes, that'll be a good thing or a wise thing to do is locate the verses where they were. But I need to restate it because I confused you guys, and I'm thinking ahead trying to recreate it, but I think I confused you guys, and I have to restate all of this if you guys don't mind.
okay. Okay.
But I'm gonna take your advice when we do this. And Zena, I apologize because I ruined your notes. But they're still good. But I have to redo this. Let me figure out how to do it without moving everything all the way out of the way. All right, here we go. So let's just start with, now we know, because what I was trying to do is get us to see that we started off really just describing the actions without knowing there were only two types of actions in this parable. All right. And what I was trying to do is collect information from the parable to show us that there were two main types of actions. All right. And that's where I should have started off, because that's where I got in my notes. However, we look at these actions as positive and negative. Let's start there. Two types of actions. I apologize.
K-Uzi,
Yes, sir.
man, please don't apologize. That will make you a good teacher.
Sorry.
You know, I mean, you can't get no better teaching than what you're doing. And professors in school would have never got up and say, "Hey, I made a mistake," you know, and let me correct you right here in class before you go any further with this. Man, that makes you a great teacher. Okay, so you don't have to apologize to me. I'm loving it. All right. Sorry about that, kids.
I agree, Mr. Credit.
There you go. Sure, you can't find no better teacher. Got so many teachers get up and say anything, then let us go on. We go, hey man, I don't want to get started. Let's go ahead back to Mr. Teacher.
That's good.
Thanks, brother. Appreciate it. All right. So yeah, let's start this way. Thanks. All right. So we're identifying actions, but from reading the parable, there are two types of actions. All right. From reading the parable, there are two types of action. There is a positive action, which can be beneficial and worthwhile. And then there's a negative action that can be harmful and worthless. All right. Now we want to list those actions. And let's start with some of the positive actions. So let's continue to, and this is where I made a mistake with you guys, is we supposed to continue to reread through the parable as we plug in this information, just to put it in perspective. And that's what we didn't do. So we want to constantly read through this parable. So it says, when you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor. Now we're getting into the main action. Not taking the place of honor. All right. And in some ways, not taking the place of honor can be viewed as a positive action by the narrator. All right. Not taking the place of honor is a positive action by the narrator. However, when we look at it from the subject's point of view, the least desirable thing for someone to do is to sit in the lowest seat or do not sit in the seat of honor, which in turns seems to be negative, which in turns seems to be worthless, which in turns seems to be harmful to my ego. It's hard for me not to sit in the place of honor when I want to be esteemed. It seems harmful. and it seems negative, and it doesn't seem like it has any value. So we want to take that in the second point in number 2, not taking the place of honor. All right. And again, we read through it just to make sure. When you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor. Although the reason of why is given next, for someone more distinguished than you may have been invited, still doesn't make this feel any better. All right. Verse 9. And he who invited you both will come to say, give your place to this man. So once again, there's 2 ways that you can do this action. You can do it willingly, or you can do it unwillingly. You can do it voluntarily, or you have to do it involuntarily. All right. So we see a voluntary way to not take the place of honor, but we see the involuntary way. And this means the one who invited you comes and instructs you to give your place to someone else, which is in turn is a negative action to all. So give place or give your place to this man.
So not taking your place of honor, that will be in verse 8, correct? I just want to make sure.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Yes. Verse 8. You got to do that part. And then give your place to this man is in verse 9. All right. Now it's redescribed. Give your place to this man, then in disgrace, you proceed to occupy the last place. So it's still a negative, harmful, or worthless appearing action, and it's given to us in verse 9, but it's restated. Proceed to occupy the last place. All right, verse 9 again. All right. So now let's let's keep reading. Verse 10. But when you are invited, go and recline at the last place. All right. So here is a voluntary way to start off the event in the opposite way. Voluntarily, you go and recline at the last place. All right. And this is a positive action because it was voluntary. And this may clarify your question earlier, Leslie. But it's voluntary. So we go and recline at the last place. All right, we see another positive action. Here, the guest begins to ask this individual to move up higher. All right, so moving up higher describes the action of sitting in a place of honor. So we see a command of move up higher, but there's an action or a response, meaning we have to sit in a place of honor. Then you will have honor in the sight of all who are at the table.
Is reclining at the Last place in verse 10, 9.
It's in, yes, in verse 10. Hold on. Yeah, verse 10. All right. Let's see. Can everybody still see the screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. So we got our observations, which one observation is the invited guests or the subjects. The next one is a summary of the action. And so to summarize these actions, we can simply say, all right, sitting in a place of honor or sitting in a place of dishonor, or we can describe it in another way of sitting in the last seat, the lowest seat, or sitting in a higher seat. All right. That's a brief summary of the actions that we see. Sitting in a place of honor or sitting in a place of dishonor, or sitting in the lower seat or sitting in the higher seat. Now the second point, let me try to. The second point, or the thing we're trying to do, is now we want to move to what we were talking about. How does, what thoughts does or do these actions produce inside of the subject? What thoughts do these actions produce within the subject, who are the invited guests? All right. So I'll say it again. What thoughts, and this is the abstract. All right. What thoughts do these actions produce in the subject? All right. Go back to my notes. And before we answer that, I want to give us this, and this is probably what I should have did earlier to keep us on track, or to make sure we're guided. So the next question we're going to answer is, what are the observable outcomes, conclusions, or the results of the actions? What are the observable outcomes, conclusions, or results of these actions? All right. And the last thing we're going to do is, because of the actions as they relate to the thoughts, what meanings do they describe? What meaning do these results describe from the thoughts? And that's how we get the meaning, is we got thoughts that these actions are going to produce in the invited guests, but each type of action produces an outcome. as we look at the thoughts, we hadn't wrote those yet, and we reflect on the outcomes, what can we conclude as the meaning of it all? I'll say that again. All right, and we hadn't wrote the thoughts down yet, but we're going to gather some thoughts as we look at these two types of actions from within the particular invited guest. What thoughts do these actions produce? And then we look at the outcomes of the actions to you and me as the reader, audience. What does it mean? How do we conclude the meaning of it all? All right. And simply say, what does it all mean? All right, now let me say it in another way. When I look at the abstract thoughts compared to the observable outcomes, what does it all mean? That's our equation. That's how we get the meaning of it. We take the abstract thoughts, we hadn't got those yet. We compare those thoughts to the outcome, which should give us an equation of what it all means. All right. Let me walk through this again. All right. So we got our observations. In our observations, there are actually two main summaries of our observations. All right. Let's see. Can everybody see my screen still? I'm trying to fix it where we can see it. Or where it'll fit.
I can't see the entire lines.
All right. So observation, A is observations. All right. We summarize two observations. We want to summarize the subjects of the parable. Then we want to summarize the main action. The subject is invited guests. When we look at the summary of the main actions in this parable, not all parables, but in this parable, we see that there are two types of actions. There's a positive, beneficial, or worthwhile action. And then there's a seemingly apparent negative, harmful, or worthless action. We see one is going voluntarily, reclining in the last place. All right. And we see another one is sitting in a place of honor. All right. Sitting in a place of honor. But we see a harmful action of not taking the place of honor, apparently. And then we see giving place to this man. And then we see proceeding to occupy the last. All right. And we'll come back and re-describe or summarize these in just a moment. And then there's another goal. The goal is to look and summarize these actions simply: sitting in a place of honor, sitting in a place of dishonor, sitting in the lowest seat and sitting in the higher seat. And this is what, if I sit in a place of honor, what kind of thoughts does that produce? We talked about that. Let's do that now. What kind of thoughts does that produce if I sit in a place of honor?
Does it
Thoughts of being
produce in who?
respected.
All right. One more time.
I said thoughts of being respected.
All right. Thoughts of being respected. Now, let's identify which action produces what thoughts. So if I sit in a place of honor, that produces a thought of being respected. Is that correct?
Well, it engenders pride.
All right. That's so that's an out. Pride is the outcome. All right. Because let me ask you this: when you say engenders pride, are you speaking from the invited guests where they feel a sense of pride, or that a sense of pride is seen from somebody else looking at that person?
I think a little of both, because Christ tells you there that if the host asks you to move up, then you'll be honored by the guest. But if he asks you to move down, so I'm thinking if a guy just walks in and grabs the seat of honor, then he's acting out of pride.
All right.
And I'm not sure how the guest would react until the host comes in and assigns seats to everybody.
All right. All right, I got you. Any other thoughts? These
Can you read that? Because I can't see it.
All right.
Sitting in a place of honor.
Or sitting in a place of dishonor. Sitting in the lowest seat or sitting in a higher seat.
Sitting in a place of honor may suggest a thought.
Oh, sitting in a place of honor may suggest a thought of pride. All right. Now, what other thoughts? Let's focus on specifically sitting in the lowest seat. What thoughts would that produce?
Maybe a thought of being humble.
Say that one more time.
Maybe a thought of being humble.
All right.
You know.
All right. Maybe a feeling or a thought of humbleness.
Correct.
All right. What other, sitting in the lowest seat, what kind of thoughts would that produce?
I would say a feeling of lack of importance.
Yes. A feeling of lack of importance.
Insecurity.
Insecurity. shame, right? Embarrassment. All right. All right. And so let's move. We'll come back here. Let's move to the last thought. What are the observable results or outcomes in the parable of these actions? What do we see some of the outcomes in these parables as these actions are being portrayed? Let's go back and read verse 8. When you're invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for someone more distinguished than you may have been invited by him. And he who invited you both will come and say to you, give your place to this man, and then in disgrace you proceed to occupy the last place. But when you are invited, go and recline the last place, so that when the one who has invited you comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher, then you will have honor in the sight of all who are at the table. All right. So think about some outcomes. What do we see as some outcomes to the actions we describe?
Pastor Kelsey,
Yes.
we see the outcome of being disgraced when one occupies a higher place and is later on requested to shift to a lower seat because one who is more honorable could have been invited. Thank you.
All right. So we see the action or the outcome of being disgraced in front of the guests. So we'll say being disgraced in front of the guests. All right. And none of these, again, none of these are answers to any problem. These are just observations still. All right. These are just descriptions of observations in a certain way. So one is we see an outcome of being disgraced in front of the guests. We also see, watch this, being moved from a higher seat to a lower seat. All right. Any other observations or results?
Well, if you do as instructed in verse 8, when you're invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, it's kind of a win-win situation, because if he doesn't move you up, you're not disgraced because he didn't have you moved down. But if he moves you up, then you're, you do get honored.
Yeah.
So that's the, that's, verse 8 is a win-win.
All right.
That
So
makes sense.
Oh yeah. Oh, it does. Let me describe it this way. Just like we said, one of the results or the actions we can observe is being disgraced in front of the guests. The other action is being honored in front of the guests. All right. And just like we said, one of the outcomes or the results of the action is being moved from a higher seat to a lower seat. We see that we can be moved from a lower seat to a higher seat. All right. So once again, remember, how simple we summarize these and how obvious some of these are. It's not a riddle, it's not a mystery, but simple observations. All right. With these simple observations are comparisons or have parallel comparisons. All right. Another observation is what type of event is this?
It's a wedding feast.
All right. We want to write that down. What type of event? In the parable, it's a wedding feast. All right. All right. So there's a wedding feast. Now, part E, we want to describe the comparisons, or we want to identify the comparisons. Remember what a parable is? And again, this is where our definition of a parable comes in handy, is because a parable is a set of illustrations that have parallel comparisons. So each one of these has a comparison. Being disgraced in front of the guests has a spiritual comparison. We see the moral truth of this is simply just being disgraced in front of the guests, being moved from a higher seat to a lower seat. All right. Being honored in front of the guests. All right. Being moved from a lower seat to a high, from a higher seat to a lower seat has another comparison. Just like being moved from a lower seat to a higher seat has another comparison. All right. And let's start with the invited guests. Remember, the invited guests have a comparison. Here, we see two types of invited guests. All right. We see invited guests to a wedding feast, and we see invited guests to what else? Where was the parable told in the beginning?
Oh, on a Sabbath day meal?
A Sabbath day meal. So originally we see two types of guests. All right. We see guests invited at a wedding feast, and we also see guests who were invited to a Sabbath day's meal. All right. But also, we have to note that there's a spiritual comparison. So let me write down the event of a wedding feast, and then also a Sabbath day's meal. Now, in the Jewish culture, what does a wedding feast represent spiritually?
The Messianic era that they were trying to get to.
All right, and what's another way to describe the Messianic era?
Wait a minute. The table of God. Let me see.
All right.
Sitting down at the table of God.
Well, the table of the Almighty is one way. And what's another way to describe the Messianic era or the table of the Almighty? When
The marriage supper of the Lamb.
All right, marriage supper of the Lamb. When does that happen? When does the marriage supper of the Lamb happen?
When Christ's enemies are defeated.
And what
made
does
his
that
footstool.
And when does that happen for us then? In this life or the life to come? So the Messianic era happens in the afterlife. So it's just another way to describe it. True. Everything you said is true. Just trying to give us another simple way to look at it. The afterlife, the Messianic era, the table of the Almighty. All right. The wedding feast of the Lamb. All right. But this is not this life. So the spiritual comparison is the rabbis trying to get the guests to think deeper, trying to get the guests to think past just a normal wedding feast. He's trying to get the invited guests to think past just the Sabbath day's meal. But what he's trying to do is get the invited guests to think about what if this happened in the afterlife? What if this was happening in the Messianic era? What was this? What if this happened at the table of the Almighty? And remember, he's trying to compare our human responses because that's what he's trying to change. We look at the human responses. If it was at a wedding feast, at a Sabbath day's meal, we look at the human responses. If it was at a wedding feast, what he's trying to get you to do now, if you were in the presence of the Almighty in the Messianic era in the afterlife, now what would your response be? And if your response in this life at the Sabbath day meal and your response at the wedding feast doesn't match up to your response in the afterlife or at the Messianic era, then we should change our response. And all he's saying is, obviously, we would. And this is how a parable provokes transformative change in the lives of the students or the audience. Is because now we have a greater comparison, and he puts it in perspective, and it begins to draw deeper conviction. Comments or questions?
Can you see?
Yes, sir.
I can see where you're going, and you have been thoroughly teaching us, and you keep using that word comparison because you use comparison where it was maybe positive for you to go and recline at the last place, and then, sitting at the last place of honor, sitting at the last place of honor. You was comparing the negative and the positive. I might have it wrong, but I got to study this and get it down. But I see where you're going, and I'm learning a lot about how to outline parables because what I'm saying, it got the parallel. If that's correct, it got to be parallel. They got to make a comparison to something.
Yeah, the parallel equals the comparison.
The parallel equals the comparison.
But whatever is parallel to means this is what I'm comparing it to, but ultimately he's trying to get us to think on a deeper level as if we are in the presence of God himself. Remember, parables takes the attributes and the characteristics of God and it compares them to the human response to that attribute and character of God. So now it takes the people from the realm of just being at a simple Sabbath days meal, from just being at a wedding feast, but ultimately the representation of the wedding feast. So now the wedding feast is the symbol for the particular students to know ultimately what the message he's actually trying to convey. And that's where our symbol is. That's the one point that we focus on. Remember, a parable, a rabbi is trying to convey one point. There's one abstract point in it all, and the symbol of the wedding feast points us to symbolic meaning of the overall point he's trying to convey. And it's centered around the spiritual comparison of a wedding feast. And this is where in their culture, see, if they don't understand who the invited guest will be, if they don't understand sitting in a place of honor versus sitting in a place of dishonor, if they don't understand being moved from a lower seat to a higher, if they don't understand from voluntarily sitting in the lowest place to be moved to a highest place, as soon as you talk about the comparison of a wedding feast to sitting at the table of the Almighty, everything begins to click. Everything begins to click. Let me do this before we get out of here. We're going to look at this again. I know I confused us earlier. I apologize. But let me do this before we get out of here. All right, can everybody see my screen?
No, it's not up there.
All right, let me go back. What about now?
Yeah.
Yes.
I can.
All right. So this is where we start putting in answers. All right. And a lot of times we summarize it in 4 or 5 points. All right. We see the invited guests. Now, the spiritual comparison to the invited guests of the parable are those who enter the Messianic era. Remember, the wedding feast was the symbolic clue of it all to help draw out the abstract point. So now, once that symbolic meaning has been conveyed, now I go back in and write down my spiritual comparisons. So now we know that he's trying to draw everybody's attention to the Messianic era, the banquet of the Almighty, the afterlife. Now I understand that the meaning of the parable of the invited guests are pointing back to individuals who are invited or enter into the Messianic era. Now let's think about this. Who can invite you, me, or anybody to the Messianic era?
Only God.
Only God. So now we know who the host is. All right. So now we look at who the host is, and now it changes the dynamics of the meaning to the hearers or the students. So this host is not just this particular chief Pharisee who invited me to his Sabbath day meal. Jesus is trying to get our attention to focus on God being the host of inviting us into the Messianic era. So now there's more at stake. And now it draws a deeper decision for us to make. So this is what it means also. If it's the messianic era I'm an invited guest to, then picking out the status or the places of honor at the table, this is what it means. The status or rank one bestows on oneself in this life. So if I pick out a place of honor, it's the status that I bestowed on myself in this life, which means I have an issue of missing the mark. And there's consequences for determining our status in the afterlife. So now it makes it more comparable, and I'll be more mindful about my status or choosing my status, because now it has a consequence that's carried over into the afterlife or the world to come, which is the messianic era. We talked about this wedding feast being symbolic of the table of the Almighty. But now let's look at someone more distinguished than you may have been invited. And this is the main point none of them got. Who was invited to this Sabbath day's meal?
Christ, the Christ.
Jesus, the Messiah. And so when he goes back to say, someone more distinguished than you may have been invited, he's not talking about ordinary rabbis who are invited as guests to teach on the matter of Torah. But ultimately, if this has anything to do with the Messianic era, we're talking about the Messiah, who the ultimate guest, the ultimate invite, right? And so the eternal King, the Son of God, someone more distinguished than you. So we know in the Messianic era, I'm not the most distinguished person there, in other words. But they didn't realize that that's one of the points he was trying to convey. All right, let's keep going. And we're going to summarize this next week. When he says, give place to this man, and then in disgrace you proceed to occupy the last place. And we see verse 11 helps us out with this. Exalting oneself over others, one can only expect to be told, go down at the table of the righteous. This is actually a saying in the Jewish culture. When you exalt yourself in this life, the outcome of it is that you can be expected to be told in the afterlife to go down at the table of the Almighty. Another statement, give place to this man, a friend move up higher. This is our example of humbling ourselves in this life. And if I humble myself in this life, one can be expected to be honored in the afterlife or at the banquet of the Almighty, which means you'll be asked to move up higher, which represents honor in front of God in the sight of all. And this parable was a lot simpler than we all probably thought we would conclude, because he gave the summary of the meaning. Basically, he was saying the goal is for you to learn how to exalt yourself. And the goal is for you to learn how to humble yourself so you can be exalted, instead of exalting yourself, which only results in being humble, which is obvious. And I'll organize this in another way next week. But I at least want to share those summaries before we get out of here today. Comments, thoughts, or reflections?
Okay, Houston,
Yes, sir.
you just showed me how to live in this world and preparing myself by the way I live in this world, what I'm gonna get in the afterlife, you know. And that's like living in this world and then in the afterlife. But a lot of people don't understand. But now you know made the I reckon you are making a comparison to this life and the afterlife, and the comparison and how they parallel each other. My actions that I have do right here will result in my rewards or whatever in the afterlife. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
Okay.
Which is obvious and simple, but the point of it is it wasn't a riddle. It's not a mystery, but it brought the abstract point or what was unknown. It made it known by using what wasn't abstract. All right. And so the abstract point simply is learning how to humble ourselves instead of having to be made humbled. Right? Because those are the outcomes. I can be made humble, or I can voluntarily humble myself. Right? And that's what we got to keep in the forefront of our minds in every situation. Because a lot of times we approach the situation and we easily find ourselves exalting ourselves before we know it. And in that case, the expectation is there's an outcome or result of being made humble. So we have to voluntarily humble ourselves. And once again, the greatest quality of it all is the quality of humility. If he was conveying one point, and the message of it all was develop humility. The summarized meaning of it all is gain some humility. And again, I know I took us the long route to get to a simple ending. But again, we're going to look at it again and we'll see a pattern, because we're going to repeat the same pattern over and over and over. And if we really think about it, you know, we'll see next week, we're going to see 4 or 5 main outline points to draw out that conclusion. All right. And let me describe them. All right. You got your subject. You have your summarized actions. You have your abstract thoughts. You have your conclusions or results, and you describe your meaning. I'll say that again. You have your subjects. You have your described actions or your summarized actions. You have your abstract thoughts. You have your conclusions or your results or your outcomes. And then you have your described meaning. So there are really 5 bullet points to every outlining of a parable. Anytime we decide to outline a parable, we should make sure we have those 5 things. And actually you'll see those in repetition as we look at other parables. I'll say them again. You're going to have your subject. You're going to have your summarized actions. You're going to have your abstract thoughts. You're going to have your outcome, conclusions, and or results. And then number 5, it's just to describe the described meaning or the meaning of it all. All right. All right. Okay. Well, that's all I have. We'll bring more clarity to it and understand it, be less confusing. but I think everybody kind of see where we're going now. Any final thoughts as we close out and get out of here for the day?
This is get to be a little bit complicated sometimes, but once it's mastered, it's going to be a great tool. I'll be glad to get the video and review it through the week.
Yeah, I guarantee this is probably the most confusing part, but in the end, it's as simple as possible. And all we will think about is the simple part of it all, right? But the first part, as I mentioned, is simply about gathering information. The gathering of information can seem confusing until we understand the goal of how we should organize it in those five areas.
Yeah.
Subject, actions, abstract thoughts, then your outcomes, and then your meaning, so yeah.
All right, looking forward to getting that video. Chew on it again.
All right. Anybody want to close us out in prayer?
I can do it there, Cuse.
I appreciate you all.
All right. Holy Father, we thank you for this great day. We thank you for what you have, the course you have set us on. We thank you for the leadership of Keuzi and the cooperation of all those that are on the call. And we thank you for the illumination that you brought, the wisdom, knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. Thank you for the ability to fellowship this way in the learning of your word. Ask you to keep everyone focused on your word. Give us the stamina and the desire to continue to repeat until we have it according to Luke 6:40. Thank you for what you're going to do between now and when we meet again. In Jesus' name, amen.
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 Love y'all. We'll see y'all.
Amen. Amen.
Amen. All right.
Everybody.
Bye, everybody.
All right. Take care.